My name is Karlijn Willems. I'm a data science journalist at DataCamp, and I'll be talking today about enhancing data journalism with Jupyter. Now, before we start off, I would like to take the time to consider data journalism and what it exactly means to our daily lives. And I wanted to start off with some examples. First and foremost, the Panama Papers, which I'm sure you'll probably already know, which was one of the biggest data leaks that happened a year ago or 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Then there's also the tennis fixed matches article that the BuzzFeed News published. Or maybe if you haven't read those articles or you aren't familiar with those news items, you might still remember the map that Jon Snow made in the 1850s on the cholera outbreak in London. Or even if you don't know all of these news items, you might know one of the following news sites or news outlets. I think that the point that I'm trying to make here is that data journalism is everywhere around us, and it has already been so for quite a number of years. And in the following slide, I'm going to list 5 milestones in the history of data journalism that I think are very important when we are considering data journalism nowadays. The first thing is, or the first year is 1821, is The Guardian's first issue, where we saw that data was really important and visualizing or getting the message across was really a problem for journalists. Now you might think that this year is quite random, and it actually is, because it has been a problem even before that. It's just The Guardian's first issue is really a milestone in that sense that we can really point out or single out. Then in 1958, data journalism was used for more social purposes, in the sense that they tried to predict the election outcome for the presidential elections. And then in 1967, Philip Meyer used data to explain or give a little bit more insights into the Detroit riots. Now, every data journalist in the room will probably also know NICAR, or the National Institute of Computer Assisted Reporting, which was founded in 1989. And then lastly, 2014, or the year that data journalism became mainstream. Now, this year I chose because this was the first year that the Data Journalism Awards were really awarded to journalists, to data journalists for their work. So what is data journalism? Well, there are as many definitions as there are data journalists. And yeah, there are a lot more to consider. So you don't need to read all of these definitions, but I just wanted to single out some words that I think are very meaningful when you talk about data journalism and the definition of it. I see story, I see data, and I see visualizations. And maybe the definition of data journalism that I like most is skillfully combining data, visuals, and narrative in a way that it becomes a meaningful data story. So you have those 3 components in a definition that doesn't consider time constraints, as some do, which is data journalism on a deadline, which can be the case, but in most cases, let's be fair, it isn't like that. And yeah, I think a more general definition fits well in this case. Also note that data story, there is sort of a link with data storytelling and its importance for data science, but I'll come back to that in a bit. And then, yeah, this is just an example to show you that the combination of data, visuals, and the narrative can be in any possible form. So you have this website where you take some input from your user, and according to that input, you'll give some more explanations, some more storytelling on, in this case, the most dangerous professions in the US. But it doesn't always need to be a web page. You can also just have a regular article like you see in the newspaper or on a news site, or even an infographic that is also a combination of all 3 of them. Now, these 3 elements are also they come back in the definitions, but they also come back in the job positions that you see that are open in news outlets, where they ask for coding acumen, design, and then, yeah, journalism skills. So these three things, they come back, and I really want to emphasize that throughout my talk as well. Now, these articles are the product of a workflow, and in 2013, Simon Rogers presented or proposed one workflow for data journalists. Maybe you all know it. It's basically gathering data, then using spreadsheets to gather that data, doing some calculations on it, and then going with the output to wherever your readers are or your users are. Now, it might just be me. I'm working at a data science company, but I think that it's really similar to this workflow, which you might also know, and which was proposed only a year ago. You take data you collected, then you transform, visualize, and model it in such a way that you actually gain understanding about it, and then you communicate your results. So I really want to make that parallel very clear, or at least it is so for me. And then as we are talking about parallels, I also want to draw your attention that this article, or any article that is produced as a part of the data science or the data journalism workflow, and the Jupyter notebook share these elements that I talked about earlier: data, visuals, and the narrative. And I think it's very clear that if you want to do data journalism and you really want to make the most out of it, you should try to use Jupyter notebooks in such a way that it becomes really open to anybody. But that's part for my next section. So yeah, building a data story. How do you go about it, and how can the Jupyter notebook help? Since the two are so perfect for each other, how do you start? Now, getting the data, that's one thing that I won't be covering in this presentation. But when you do start, there is one apparent trap or pitfall that data journalists often encounter, and that is, you have the data, and you sort of get lost in your data. You don't explore it, and you depart a little bit more from the story rather than your data. And I think that the Jupyter notebook really helps you to focus on the data and to analyze and explore it, and to really find your outliers and everything that you need to know to gain understanding about your topic that you're dealing with. And especially I want to draw your attention to the magics that are used here. I think it won't be new for those who have been using the Jupyter notebook for a while now. But this is also very handy, not only to do exploratory data analysis, but especially when you're doing data journalism on a deadline, as you can well imagine. And then there is this case which I want to highlight. It's an article, maybe you already know it. It's written by Walt Hickey and published for 538, in which women in the film industry are the topic that is being dealt with. And it was published in 2014. Now, why this article is so important to me when I'm talking about Jupyter notebooks and data journalism is because this was really a milestone, because another journalist, Brian Keegan, noticed that the analysis was irreproducible. So what did he do? He made a Jupyter notebook, the first one that I can remember at least, that tried to reproduce the analysis, came to a couple of other conclusions, and then really openly discussed these analyses and these discussions with the original author. And this will become much more important in the rest of the presentation, where I'm actually working towards a public-powered model of data journalism. So you see, the Jupyter notebook is not only good for when you're exploring data, but definitely for the reproducibility of data journalism, which as of 2014 was much more apparent. After this case, news outlets started publishing their data, their analyses on GitHub. And as we know it now, there is even a package for 538, an R package. So a lot of things have already been changed. Something that data journalists don't often use, but which I think that can certainly have its merits, is the watermark. Yeah, I don't really see it a lot in Jupyter notebooks that are being shared on GitHub, but I think we should start doing that because of the obvious information that you give to other users to reproduce your analysis and to really get started with data journalism as well. Now, something that most of you who work with Jupyter notebooks will also know is that you can easily add visuals to it. I don't need to explain the importance of visuals in data journalism. They are there to support the story, to give extra context to your data, and you don't get lost with your data. You actually tell a story. But more than the general libraries that you might know, the Python libraries or the R libraries, you also have the widgets, which really make the story a lot more interactive. You give the user some input to the story, and yeah, it will increase engagement with your story, which is really important, I think, when you're doing data journalism. And then the last thing is that you can obviously add images or MP4s to your notebook, which will also add to the general experience of your notebook and of your reader, of the story, everything actually. And then the last part, the narrative. I feel it's so often overlooked, the narrative, especially when notebooks are shared across social media. I'm talking about data journalism notebooks. You see a lot of the analysis, you see a lot of code, but you don't really see a lot of narrative. And there are some data story typologies that you can follow, like this one from Andrew Flowers. But rather than following those typologies, I actually advocate an approach that takes into account narrative theory. Because as Aristotle already saw or noticed way back in the days, the plot is really the most important in a story or in a drama, whatever you're talking about. And it's a unified sequence of events that has a causal relationship. Now, that might seem really theoretical. So that's why I'm really giving this example of Freytag's pyramid, which actually builds on Aristotle's narrative theory and talks about exposing your story, then having a rising action, climax, falling action, and a denouement or conclusion. Now, this is really a fancy drawing for saying your story should have a beginning, a body, and an end. Seems really simple, but it's often overlooked. And I think that if you try to follow this type of approach, you'll always be there, and you'll make sure that you don't jump to conclusions, that you give enough context for your story, and that, yeah, you will just not miss that type of the story that you really need to talk to your readers. Another couple of concepts that are really nice to have in mind when you're talking about narrative, and especially for the Jupyter notebook, which is really a nice environment to really work with that, is focalization, or the perspective from which you want to tell your story. Temporality, do I want to narrate or build my story in a more sequential way, or do I want to make jumps in time? And then the last part, mimesis or diegesis, also a very theoretical concept, only to show you the difference between showing and telling. Sometimes showing is a lot more important than telling everything. And that's especially true when you're working with visuals in the Jupyter notebook, where you can actually give the user the chance to input some things or to change around some things, and then you actually show instead of tell. Some extra stuff that are really important when you're working with a Jupyter notebook in data journalism are the spell check extension, for example, and the numerous output options that you might want to make use of. I think Pelican is by far one of the most favorite options as a data journalist, especially because a lot of data journalists still operate individually rather than in teams. So they have their own portfolio, and there the Pelican might really come in handy. And then as a last thing to mention, I want to really make sure that I mention NBDime, which is a way of collaborating for data journalists, but also data scientists. I think data journalists can make use of that a little bit more to work together. And with this, I want to evolve more towards a public-powered model of data journalism. Now, this public-powered model might seem a little bit strange, but it really resides in the larger space of data activism, which uses data for a social good, or open source movements, hacker movements. It all resides in that. And what it boils down to is that maybe you won't realize it, but a lot of the stories come from just stories that you have in mind, and then you go and look for the data. Now, data journalists, they can also make use of that story and really make sure that they ask for input from users who might not be technically schooled, but that doesn't matter. Just ask input from your readers and then go beyond that. But that's something that the next slide will really show a little bit more clearly. So this is actually design thinking. You see all of these things. You start with empathize, ideate, define, and so on. And I think that also in this, the Jupyter notebook will come in handy, because you can use it to really ask your readers the questions that you want to know. What are they interested in reading? You have a topic, let's say the crisis. You ask your users, what questions are you most interested in getting answers to? And you can really collect all of those feedback into your Jupyter notebook or in a regular text file, which the Jupyter notebook application also offers, and then prototype and test the things that you want to be testing, or the answers that you want to be giving in the Jupyter notebook, and then repeat that process all over again. Now, the public-powered model of data journalism is about collaborating, maybe not with technically schooled users, but definitely with all people that are interested in collaborating. And there are still a lot of things that we can work on to make that happen. Being a part of education and data science education, I still feel that there is a need to work on that, or to at least focus on that, because you have a lot of journalists who are looking to turn to data journalism, but that don't really have the background in statistics, or that don't really know how to get started. So in order for us to evolve to that public-powered model, we need to focus a lot more on education, but also collaboration. As I said before, a lot of data journalists operate alone. They have their portfolio, they work as a freelance for other news outlets, and there is not so much collaboration. Okay, you have the Panama Papers, where a lot of newsrooms work together in the sense that they analyze the data, but the stories, they all were published in separate news outlets. There wasn't one real story. I mean, there is the website, but you still see what I'm saying. There was a lot of separate divergence between the newsrooms themselves. And then the last part is reproducibility. I think I've focused a lot on that, but it still remains an issue. It has been since 2014 for data journalism, and it will still remain a focal point for the future. I think Jupyter and the advances that it's making will definitely help us data journalists to make this happen. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Have you done any training of, I mean, who is actually a journalist here? Anybody? Okay. So have you done any training with actual journalists to try and bring some of these things to them?
No, I haven't. I have written a lot of articles, but I haven't done any physical training. Yeah.
I was just wondering, the second loaded question after that would be like, what are the challenges in bringing these tools to journalists?
I think there are already a lot of journalists that are aware that they need to be using other tools besides the ones that they are currently using. They are definitely aware that they need to change stuff in the educational programs at school. But I'm not sure if the Jupyter notebook is really used to that extent. Like the most things that you will see in any journalism program at the moment is just a basic intro to Python or R. And then if you're very lucky, maybe they'll mention the Jupyter notebook. But I think that there is still a lot of work there, yeah.
I'd like to comment on that. I'm Meredith, the
Hi.
Executive Director of the Wesley Data Innovation Hub.
Mm-hmm.
We partnered with datascience.com last year and had Jamie Whitaker from Project Jupyter come and do some demos
Mm-hmm.
at that stage. And there were folks from the LA Times, the New York Times, and so forth, also giving their like best practices and lessons learned about data journalism. So
Mm-hmm.
your suggestion is a great next step in terms of doing some hands-on training.
Yeah.
Really sharing more than just each person giving presentations and working on problems.
That's, yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because at least in the context that I'm operating in Belgium, it's, yeah, I think there are really a lot of steps that can still be taken. I don't think that the journalism programs at this point even do what your school is doing, or, yeah. I think we still have a long way to go, especially in Belgium then. Yeah, that's great to hear. Yes?
What, in the coming era of data journalism, what do you think is the balance between using data to tell the story and using data to originate the story? And what I mean by that is like, in a professional setting, you know, people like to kind of have their story and then they look for the data to support it.
Yeah.
As opposed to something like Spotlight, where, you know, it was actually like analyzing the data.
I think that that's an interesting idea to shift that balance a little bit. I think most of it, the fact that we have a story and that we go and look for the data afterwards also originates from the fact that most of us are traditionally schooled in the sense that we learn to code later. So we have the story in mind and then we need to get some proof. But as we go along and we have this education which continues to improve, data journalists or journalists in itself will be better trained and occupied to get hands-on with the data first and then get the story out there. So yeah, I hope in the future that it will be a little bit the other way around. Of course, it will still be data journalism, so I don't think that we can totally move away from having the story first and then going to the data. I hope it will be 60-40, yeah. Yeah.
How does your work at DataCamp look like?
Excuse me?
How does your work at DataCamp look like?
My work at DataCamp, I usually focus on data science. So we have a community at DataCamp, and I'm always looking for guest contributors if you're interested. And my work is basically, I work a lot with R Markdown and then the Jupyter notebook to write tutorials for people who are just starting out. But I mean, recently I've also been writing a lot of definitive guides to, for example, the Jupyter notebook, or explaining the difference between IPython or Jupyter. In that sense, my work is less novelty oriented and more making sure that everybody understands what is out there. So I'm taking the educational perspective with my work. Yes.
I have a question. I have a friend who's works at a newspaper, and a lot of her challenges seem to be like IT related in a way. Like she like has to stand up, like she has become an IT person and like has to stand up servers or a database for people to even work on. And I wondered if you have any thoughts about like kind of the infrastructure side of data journalism.
Yeah, specifically about the infrastructure, I'm not really trained to do that, but I can tell you that it's an issue that occurs worldwide. Because if you have one person that is a little bit schooled even, they will ask you anything. It's like when you study computer sciences, everybody will ask you to fix their computer, whatever their problem is. And you see the same thing occurring in data journalism. One person knows how to tell a story and knows how to analyze data, and all of a sudden you're in charge of the whole IT department at your newspaper. Yeah, I don't have any ideas on the infrastructure itself, but I do think that it will improve in the future as we really make sure that we educate people well and make sure that the importance of data journalism and the difference between data journalism and IT becomes a little bit more clear in the newsroom and the people deciding on the team composition. Yeah.
You mentioned briefly a lot of ways that you can turn Markdown or notebooks into blogs and this stuff. You know, Pelican is an example of that.
Yeah.
So, do you have any idea, like in large newsrooms, what type of best practices there are for authoring techniques?
At this point, there aren't really a lot of best practices as far as I know. As I said, a lot of people or a lot of data journalists operate individually, so whatever that individual's preference is, that will be mostly the way to go. Yeah. I do think that we can work towards unifying that a little bit more, but it's also because there are some, yeah, I would say that we can really, as within data journalism, I think we can focus more on getting tools like the Jupyter notebook out there, because I think a lot of journalists use it, but then not to the full extent that they should be using it, which is also something that I briefly mentioned in the presentation with the water print, for example. I don't see that anywhere, and I think it would be really useful for people to see those type of things. Yeah.
Is the limiting factor in your mind, though, exposure, education, or is it the killer app is still missing?
Excuse me?
Is the problem with the data journalists that they don't have the education?
I
Or is it a killer app problem? Like there's workflow management, there's just like something missing from the...
I think it's a combination of both, but first and foremost, from what I have read and from what I've seen in the data journalism space, I think it's mostly a problem of education. I've literally seen a tweet on Twitter of somebody saying, I wish I had taken some statistics classes when I was actually studying, because I'm using it way more often than I think I would have needed it, or than I thought back then that I would have needed it. So I think that, like, I think most journalists that are working in this space realize that they need to step up their game, and I think that the education is still lagging behind a little bit in making sure that journalists are better equipped to deal with the challenges that the data brings to them. Yeah.
To kind of expand on that, I've been using like the Markdown representation notebooks
Mm-hmm.
for internal documentation.
Yeah.
And it's been working, have good feedback, but it seems like now everything widgets and that layer is not representable in the Markdown, but only in the actual posted notebook.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love to have that, but I don't see that as immediately available. I don't want that to be a limitation of the documentation aspect of using the notebook.
Yeah. I can't really comment on that. Yeah. I think it's a great suggestion, though. Yeah.
Just to speak for the widgets, somebody else here. You know, that has proceeded. You can get more widgets to survive in the viewer, if you want to think about it that way. And that model where the data is the thing that you hand around versus like the build image and stuff like that is getting a lot stronger. So if you look at the iPad widgets documentation, it's full of widgets, right? And they don't always do anything because like suddenly now you can't actually use Python.
Yeah.
You're stuck with just whatever JavaScript has. But when you go to print, like you don't want servers, you don't want databases, you just want a site that just works. And so we're trying. We're trying.
That's great.
It's kind of dead pixels rule.
And on that topic, like the Jupyter developers are here doing user testing, like just down the hall, if you wanted to go like give them directly some feedback. We have time for more questions. If there are any more questions for Karlijn.
I had a question about, I don't know if it's best practices or guidance for crafting narrative in a notebook that you've seen used in data journalism, and how that can be applied to fields outside of data journalism. So I come from an academic background in writing notebooks, and there's still a role for narrative, I think, in communicating with whether it's advisors or fellow
Yeah, I can mostly talk for data journalism. And I also said, like, I don't really see a lot of narrative being used in the Jupyter notebooks as much as they could have been. I think it's definitely something to work on, but there aren't any standards that people are following at this point. Sometimes in the GitHub repositories, you just see the analysis. Sometimes you just see one sentence. I think there is a lot of things that we can still improve. Yeah. So yeah, I can't really comment on that, like, since there aren't any standards. Or there don't seem to be.
Has anybody written anything down though? That's a good place to start. Like, say I want to become a data journalist, where would I start?
There is a data journalism handbook, which I find really nice. But there is, as far as I know, the only GitHub repository that I find really interesting to look at is the one of Brian Keegan, where he actually does use the narrative to really go into the analysis. So this one on the right-hand side.
Hi. Just like to comment a little bit about where to learn about data journalism.
Mm-hmm.
There's two doctoral programs, one at Columbia University, the other one at Stanford. You can probably find their faculty and reach out to them. They may have other information on their websites.
Okay, thank you.
Question over here.
Yeah, question and a comment are kind of related to the previous question. So the question is whether you're aware of people using tools like MyBinder to actually, like in data journalism context, to actually make it simpler for people to rerun the analysis even weeks or months later than that
Mm-hmm.
newspaper article. And the comment would then be one such reuse case could be Wikipedia, where Jupyter notebooks have become to be linked, normally in more or less scientific contexts, but they could be used also in the journalism context. And then the next question there here is like translating, because the original report or notebook will be written in one language,
Yeah.
I mean human language,
Mm-hmm.
and then Wikipedia exists in multiple languages, and here licensing comes in. Many of the data journalism notebooks don't have any licensing information, or if so, then there's lots of prohibition in terms of reuse. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that is, first and foremost, great suggestion. I think it sounds great. I haven't heard of it personally. I do think that it should be, I mean, also thinking from the open source movement, I do think that it should be possible to have translations of the same material, also because normally the copyright still is respected. I mean, the article still belongs to you, and if you give permission as an author to have your article translated, that shouldn't be any problem. I do know about data visualizations of one data journalist in Belgium, who made this data visualization, and then it got translated by other news outlets. So I do think that people still do it, but maybe not as much as they could be doing. And this is just for a data visualization, so it's not for an article. But I do think that it should be possible, yes. Yeah.
All right, if there are no more questions, let's thank Karlijn again.
Thank you.